In 2021, the singer-songwriter Sia wrote and directed the movie Music, which centers around a character who has autism and is supposed to be how she views the world around her. The film received ample amount of backlash, for one of the reasons being that Maddie Ziegler, who is a neurotypical actress, was cast to play the neurodiverse character. As a result, the character's movements and gestures were not only inauthentic, they were downright offensive. As a critic from the New York Times puts it on February 11th, 2021, neither Ziegler nor Sia are autistic, and the collaboration on this film reduces disability to mannerisms indistinguishable from mockery. Historically, Hollywood has been guilty of casting neurotypicals and non-disabled individuals to perform the parts of neurodivergent and disabled individuals. This is nothing new. I'm sure that you've all either heard of or even seen media such as The Witches, Me Before You, Forrest Gump, Rain Man, and $1 Million Baby. We must stop disability drag and focus more heavily on creating accurate representation for the disabled community. In order for us to do this, we will first understand the problem of disability drag, its underlying effects, before finally concluding with some simple solutions. Because as Diana Theobald, senior manager of Warner Media, explains, disability is the only minority that can affect anyone at any time. It overlaps with every other identity. In order for us to understand the problem of disability drag, we must first talk about what its definition is. The practice of hiring a non-disabled person to perform a character with a disability is the practice of disability drag. It reinforces negative beliefs about the community. Among those beliefs is ableism, which is the belief that people with disabilities are a liability to society, and because of their liability status, they are often seen as people of inferior worth. Despite the fact that people with disabilities make up 15% of the population, as claimed by the World Bank on March 19th, 2021, according to a USC Annenberg report that was published September of 2020, only 2.3% of all speaking characters across the top 100 grossing films of 2019 were depicted with a disability. And of those 2.3%, most of them reinforce stigmas about the community affecting how those with a disability view themselves and how others view them. On September 23rd, 2021, I got the privilege to interview a senior manager at Warner Media, Diana Theobald. Theobald, who works in the Inclusion and Equity Department and also happens to be a below-the-knee amputee, explains that a barrier she faces is that there aren't enough people with disabilities who are open about their disabilities in the workplace. And when looking at modern movies like Music that teach that people with disabilities are an issue to be dealt with, it is no wonder why some people with disabilities choose to keep their disabilities secret. Moreover, this ideology parallels how casting agencies view casting individuals with a disability, as they see it as an impossible task. This leads me to my second issue. Casting agencies preferring to hire non-disabled performers to perform the parts of people with disabilities. In a Huffington Post article that was published August 27th, 2021, one of the actresses that was interviewed was Future Carter. Carter, who is a wheelchair user, recalls a time when she was invited to a casting call, only to later realize that the casting was on a second floor with no accessible entrance. She then later tells the Huffington Post that, "I often get asked if I can show able-bodied actors how to use a wheelchair convincingly. If Carter did this, she'd be encouraging disability drag." Now that we've talked about the general issue, let's now talk about the underlying causes, namely disability tropes and the lack of diversity shown within the disabled community. While there are many tropes that have a negative impact on the disabled community, most of them can be found in the Ford Foundation's pamphlet titled The Roadmap to Inclusion, published in 2019. Starting with the supercrip, when the disabled character overcomes their disability because of their supernatural abilities. The issue is not that the disabled character is superhuman. Rather, the issue is that according to this trope, disability is something that needs to be overcome. As seen in the movie Shazam, as one of the main characters, Freddie Freeman, who has a mobility impairment, transforms into a crime-fighting flying superhero with no impairment. This gives the illusion that only those without a disability can live an adventurous life. Next, there's the villain. When the character's appearance is something that is looked upon as innately sinister, as seen in the movie The Witches, as Anne Hathaway's character, the Grand Witch, is depicted having limb differences, teaching that those with limb differences are evil and cannot be trusted. Lastly, there is the victim. When the disabled character pities themselves and might even come to the conclusion that suicide is better than living a life with a permanent disability. As seen in movies like $1 Million Baby, as the main protagonist Maggie, who becomes injured in a boxing match, resulting in her becoming a quadriplegic, she ultimately decides that because of her new quadriplegic state, she no longer has the will to live. And she pleads with her coach, asking him to help her die. And the coach follows through with this request, teaching that living a life with a permanent disability is a life that is not worth living. Teaching that lives like my own are lives that are not worth living. As mentioned before, disability tropes are not the only mechanism that can distort an image of a community. Showing lack of diversity of the community itself can also do this. Going back to the same USC report that was mentioned earlier, of the 19 films that did depict characters with a disability, most of those depictions were shown as white males. This gives the illusion that disability does not affect all demographics. This is further testified by Maysoon Zayid, a Muslim woman with cerebral palsy, as she explains that anytime you do see disability, it's a white boy. Now that we've talked about the underlying causes, let's now talk about some solutions on both the corporate and the individual level. Starting with the corporate level, hiring people with disabilities in front and behind the camera will be the only way to ensure that well-rounded stories and characters are told. Going back to my interview with Dinah Theobald explains that another barrier she faces is that people without disabilities can be hesitant to write or draw a character with a disability because they're afraid of getting it wrong. But this reinforces my point that if people with disabilities were part of the production process, this wouldn't be an issue, as seen in movies like The Peanut Butter Falcon. The Peanut Butter Falcon is about a boy who runs away from home in his pursuit to become a professional wrestler. What makes this story unique is that both the character and the actor, Zach Gottsagen, happen to have Down syndrome. While the movie addresses the internal and external ableism that surrounds Zach's life, the movie's main focus is about Zach finding his own ambitions. Theobald also adds that she would love to see characters with disabilities doing normal stuff, and it can be argued that movies like The Peanut Butter Falcon have paved the way for future films to achieve this. As for the individual, I've created a website that gives a list of media that support disability drag and media that does not, so that you as an individual can create a better informed decision on what media to support. Lastly, there is also an email template that strongly urges media conglomerates to reevaluate how they portray those with disabilities using their platforms. The pamphlet will be provided at the end of the presentation. Lastly, if you're an individual with a disability like myself, if you're willing, I strongly encourage you to start talking about disability misconceptions whenever appropriate. Now that we've talked about the solutions, let's conclude. Hiring people with disabilities in front and behind the camera will be the only way to ensure that disability drag and its harmful effects come to a complete end. As someone who's grown up with a disability since birth, I did not see people like myself on the big or small screen. As a child, this negatively affected how I saw myself and how others saw me. As on the rare occasion that there was a character with a disability, they were depicted as helpless victims, people with no ambitions of their own. only allowed to be happy and participate in society once they became fully cured. As a child, this made me upset, and as an adult, I am infuriated that a blatant prejudice against the disabled community is labeled and celebrated as a cinematic masterpiece. In 2019, the Peanut Butter Falcon became the talk of the town for doing something as simple as hiring an actor with the same disability as their character. Hopefully someday soon, this won't be so unique, but rather the norm.